The autumn sun was setting over Burlington, Vermont, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. Police Chief Brandon Del Pozo was driving home after spending his Sunday at a community outreach event. The meeting had gone well. Local residents had shared their concerns about neighborhood safety, and together they'd brainstormed solutions that would work for everyone. After 3 years as chief, he'd learned that these face-to-face conversations were the backbone of good community policing. The dashboard clock showed 6:45 p.m. as he cruised down Main Street in his unmarked black sedan. His mind wandered to the stack of paperwork waiting on his desk tomorrow morning and the upcoming town hall meeting where he'd be presenting new community policing initiatives. The department had made progress under his leadership, but there was still so much work to be done. Through his rearview mirror, he noticed a patrol car that had been following him for the past few blocks. At first, he didn't think much of it. Patrol cars were a common sight in this part of town. But something felt off about the way this one stayed right behind him, matching his every lane change. His years of experience told him he was being tailed. The chief ran through a mental checklist. His speed was steady at exactly 30 miles per hour, his registration was current, and all his lights were working. He checked them just yesterday. There was no reason for anyone to pull him over. Still, that patrol car hung close, its presence growing more conspicuous by the minute. The radio played softly in the background, some old Eagles song about taking it easy. The irony wasn't lost on him as his grip tightened slightly on the steering wheel. The sun had nearly disappeared now, and the streetlights were flickering to life one by one along Main Street. The evening traffic was light, just a few cars heading home from weekend errands or early dinner plans. He passed the public library on his right, its brick facade warm in the last rays of sunlight. A few students sat on the front steps, backpacks at their feet, probably cramming for upcoming midterms. The scene was perfectly normal, perfectly peaceful, except for that patrol car still on his tail. Just past the library, as he half expected, red and blue lights suddenly erupted in his rearview mirror. The patrol car's siren chirped twice, the universal police signal to pull over. Del Pozo took a deep breath and guided his sedan to the curb, positioning it perfectly as he taught countless officers to do during traffic stops. His mind was clear as he followed the procedure he knew by heart. Turn off the engine, keep hands visible on the steering wheel, wait for the officer to approach. Through his side mirror, he watched the patrol car door open. A figure emerged, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the distinctive gait of a veteran officer. The chief could hear the measured footsteps approaching his car, accompanied by the subtle crunch of fallen leaves under police-issue boots. He kept his eyes forward, hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, just like he instructed citizens to do during hundreds of community workshops on traffic stop safety. In that moment, sitting in his car waiting for the approaching officer, Del Pozo felt something shift in his perspective. He wasn't just the chief of police anymore. He was experiencing what thousands of citizens experienced every day. The vulnerability, the uncertainty, the supple tension of being pulled over, even when you've done nothing wrong. This was supposed to be a routine traffic stop, if there was even a legitimate reason for it. But as the footsteps grew closer, Del Pozo had a growing feeling that what was about to unfold would be anything but routine. Maybe it was his decades of police experience, or maybe it was just instinct, but something told him this encounter was going to be different. The beam of a flashlight swept across his side mirror, then his window, even though there was still enough daylight to see clearly. It was an unnecessary show of authority, a detail that didn't escape his notice. As the officer reached his window, Del Pozo prepared himself for what was to come, knowing that the next few minutes could go in any number of directions. Little did he know that this seemingly routine traffic stop on a quiet Sunday evening would become a turning point, not just for him, but for the entire police department and the community they served. Sometimes the most profound changes start with the smallest moments, and this moment was about to become much bigger than anyone could have anticipated. The cool evening air drifted through his slightly opened window, carrying with it the scent of fallen leaves and the distant aroma of someone's Sunday dinner. On the surface, it was just another traffic stop on just another autumn evening in Burlington. But something in the atmosphere, something in the way this situation was unfolding, suggested that this encounter would be remembered long after the sun had set. The officer tapped on the window with his flashlight, a sharp, authoritative rap that seemed unnecessarily loud in the quiet evening air. Del Pozo pressed the button to lower his window completely, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. The crisp autumn breeze carried the scent of coffee from the officer's travel mug, mixed with the leather polish from his utility belt. "License and registration," the officer demanded, not bothering with the customary greeting that department training emphasized. His voice carried an edge that felt out of place for a routine traffic stop. Del Pozo noticed how the officer's hand rested near his utility belt, a subtle but telling detail that spoke volumes about his state of mind. "Of course, officer," Del Pozo replied calmly. "I'm going to reach for my wallet now. It's in my back pocket." He narrated his movements just as he taught his officers to let citizens do, knowing how crucial clear communication was in these situations. The leather of his seat creaked softly as he shifted to retrieve his wallet. The beam from the flashlight followed his every move, despite the street being well lit by both the remaining daylight and the newly activated street lamps. The officer's breathing was slightly elevated, another detail that Del Pozo's trained ear picked up. Something about this stop had the officer on edge, and that realization made Del Pozo even more determined to handle everything with perfect composure. As he handed over his license and registration, Del Pozo noticed the officer's nameplate, Officer Miller. The silver badge beneath it identified him as being from the neighboring department just outside Burlington's jurisdiction. Miller barely glanced at the documents before launching into his questioning. "You know why I pulled you over?" Miller's tone was challenging, almost confrontational. His posture had changed subtly upon seeing Del Pozo's face, a slight stiffening of the shoulders, a barely perceptible step backward. The flashlight beam remained fixed, unnecessarily bright, and aimed slightly too high. "No, sir, I don't," Del Pozo responded truthfully. "I was maintaining the speed limit and following all traffic laws." He kept his tone professional and courteous, even as he noticed Miller's free hand clenching and unclenching at his side. "You were weaving between lanes back there," Miller claimed, though both men knew this wasn't true. "And your window tint looks darker than regulation." The excuse was flimsy. The car's windows were factory standard, and Del Pozo had been driving perfectly straight. A couple walked past on the sidewalk, their casual evening stroll slowing as they noticed the scene unfolding. Del Pozo could feel their concerned glances, but he kept his attention focused on Officer Miller. The situation was becoming increasingly tense, and he knew the next few moments would be crucial. "Officer Miller," Del Pozo started, maintaining his calm demeanor, "I respect that you're doing your job, but I have to disagree with your assessment. I've been driving carefully, and my vehicle meets all regulations." He paused, weighing his next words carefully. "Would you mind telling me which department you're from?" Miller's reaction was immediate. A slight flush crept up his neck, visible even in the dimming light. "Are you questioning my authority?" he demanded, his voice rising slightly. The flashlight beam wavered for a moment before steadying again. In the distance, a car horn honked, making Miller flinch almost imperceptibly. Del Pozo noticed how the officer's jaw clenched, how his stance shifted slightly. These were the subtle signs of someone struggling to maintain control of a situation that wasn't going as planned. "Not at all, officer," Del Pozo replied evenly. "I'm simply trying to understand the situation." He kept his hands visible on the steering wheel, even though every instinct told him to reach for his own badge. The moment needed to play out naturally. Miller shuffled the license and registration in his hands, squinting at them more closely now. His expression changed as he finally read the occupation listed on the license. The flashlight beam dipped slightly, then raised again, as if he was double-checking what he'd just seen. "You're?" Miller started, his voice trailing off as realization began to dawn. The confident facade cracked just slightly, uncertainty creeping into his features. Del Pozo nodded slowly. "Yes, I'm the chief of police for Burlington." He let the words hang in the air, not as a threat or challenge, but as a simple statement of fact. "And I think we need to have a conversation about what's happening here." The silence that followed was heavy with tension. A gentle breeze rustled through the trees lining Main Street, sending a few more leaves spiraling down to join those already scattered on the sidewalk. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, the sound echoing off the brick buildings. Miller's posture had changed completely now. The flashlight beam wavered again, then lowered entirely. His mouth opened and closed several times, as if he was struggling to find the right words, or any words at all. The swagger and aggression from moments ago had evaporated, replaced by something that looked a lot like shame. The moment stretched out between them, filled with unspoken realizations and uncomfortable truths. Both men knew this wasn't just about a traffic stop anymore. It had become something much more significant, a mirror reflecting deep-rooted issues that needed to be addressed. Del Pozo could have handled this moment in many ways. He could have been angry, confrontational, or vindictive. Instead, he saw something in Miller's expression that made him take a different approach. Behind the badge and the bravado, he recognized something familiar, the look of someone facing their own biases for the first time. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Officer Miller's radio crackled to life, breaking the heavy silence. Another officer's voice came through, asking if he needed backup. Miller's hand hovered over his radio for a moment before he responded with a quick, negative, "Situation under control." But the situation was far from under control, at least not in the way Miller had planned. His earlier confidence had crumbled, replaced by visible discomfort as he stood face to face with the reality of his actions. The dash cam on his patrol car continued recording silently, capturing every moment of this encounter that had gone so differently than he'd expected. "Officer Miller," Del Pozo spoke again, his voice level and measured. "I'd like to listen to your radio communications from before you approached my vehicle." It wasn't really a request, and both men knew it. The chief had heard enough radio chatter in his career to know that officers sometimes revealed their true thoughts in those moments before a stop. Miller's face paled slightly under the glow of the street lamp. The wind had picked up, sending a few stray leaves skittering across the pavement between them. A group of college students walked past on the opposite sidewalk, their laughter and chatter creating a stark contrast to the intensity of the moment unfolding by the curb. "Sir, Miller started, then stopped. His hand dropped from his utility belt and his shoulders sagged slightly. The transformation was remarkable. Gone was the aggressive officer from moments ago, replaced by someone who looked almost lost. Those communications were unprofessional. "I figured as much," Del Pozo replied. He finally reached for his own badge, moving slowly and deliberately. The gold shield caught the light as he held it up. "But I think we need to hear them. All of them, including what you said when you first spotted my vehicle." Miller shifted his weight uncomfortably, knowing the dashcam had captured everything. His earlier comments about the driver's appearance, the assumptions he'd made, the coded language he'd used when calling in the plate, it was all there, recorded for review. "Chief, I can explain," Miller began, but Del Pozo raised his hand gently to stop him. "Not here," the chief said firmly. "This isn't a conversation for the side of the road, but it is a conversation we need to have." He paused, looking directly at Miller. "Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m., at my office. Bring the dashcam footage and your radio logs." A couple of cars drove past slowly, their drivers craning their necks to observe the unusual scene, a uniformed officer looking increasingly uncomfortable while a plainclothes man sat calmly in his vehicle. The blue and red lights from Miller's patrol car continued to paint the scene in alternating colors, creating moving shadows that danced across both men's faces. "You're not filing a complaint?" Miller asked, surprise evident in his voice. His hand unconsciously moved to his badge, as if he was already imagining it being taken away. Del Pozo shook his head slowly. "That would be the easy way out, wouldn't it? File a complaint, start an investigation, let the system handle it. But tell me, Officer Miller, what would that really solve?" He let the question hang in the air between them. The night had grown cooler, and Del Pozo could see Miller's breath forming small clouds in the autumn air. Somewhere nearby, a church bell began to toll the hour, the deep, resonant sounds echoing off the buildings around them. "I've been doing this job for 15 years, Miller said quietly, almost to himself. His voice had lost its earlier edge, replaced by something that sounded like uncertainty. "I've always thought I was one of the good ones." "Most of us do," Del Pozo replied. "That's what makes this work so challenging. We don't always see our own biases until they're staring us in the face." He glanced at his watch, then back at Miller. Tomorrow morning, we're going to review everything that happened here. Every decision, every assumption, every word spoken into that radio. And then we're going to have a real conversation about what it means to serve and protect everyone in our community." Miller nodded slowly, his expression a mixture of shame and resignation. He handed back Del Pozo's license and registration with slightly trembling hands. The papers rustled in the evening breeze as they passed between them. 9 a.m. sharp, Miller confirmed, his voice barely above a whisper. "And Officer Miller," Del Pozo added as the officer began to turn away. "Bring an open mind. Tomorrow isn't about punishment, it's about growth." He started his engine but kept his window down. Sometimes the hardest moments in our careers become the most important ones. As Miller walked back to his patrol car, his boots scuffing against the pavement, Del Pozo watched in his rearview mirror. The officer's usually confident stride was gone, replaced by the slightly hunched walk of someone carrying a heavy weight on their shoulders. The weight of realization, of confronting uncomfortable truths about oneself. The blue and red lights finally switched off, plunging the street back into the gentle glow of street lamps. As Del Pozo pulled away from the curb, he knew tomorrow would be challenging for both of them. But sometimes, the most important changes start with the most difficult conversations. The next morning arrived with a heavy fog hanging over Bellington, matching the weight of anticipation in the air. Del Pozo arrived at his office early, well before the scheduled 9 a.m. meeting. The police station was quietly coming to life, with the night shift heading home and day shift officers filtering in, coffee cups in hand. He spent the first hour reviewing the incident report he'd written the night before. Every detail was there: the unnecessary stop, the aggressive tone, the subtle and not-so-subtle signs of prejudice. But there was something else too: potential. Del Pozo had seen something in Miller's final expression that gave him hope. The office coffee maker gurgled in the corner as he prepared 2 cups. He'd learned long ago that difficult conversations sometimes went better with a hot drink on the table. The aroma of fresh coffee filled the room, mixing with the morning sunlight that was finally breaking through the fog outside his window. At exactly 8:55 a.m., there was a knock on his door. Miller stood there, looking like he hadn't slept much. His uniform was perfectly pressed, his boots spotlessly shined, the kind of extra effort someone puts in when they're nervous. In his hands, he clutched a USB drive that presumably contained the dashcam footage. "Come in, Officer Miller," Del Pozo said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "Coffee?" Miller nodded gratefully, sinking into the chair. His usual confidence was nowhere to be seen. Instead, there was something different in his demeanor, a mixture of shame, anxiety, and perhaps a hint of curiosity about what was to come. "I watched the footage last night," Miller said quietly, placing the USB drive on the desk between them. "All of it, including the radio communications." He wrapped his hands around the warm coffee cup but didn't drink. I don't know what to say." Del Pozo leaned back in his chair, studying the officer before him. "Sometimes it's better to start by listening," he said, reaching for the USB drive. He inserted it into his computer and turned the monitor so they both could see. The next few minutes were uncomfortable as they watched the previous evening's events unfold. Miller winced at his own voice coming through the speakers, especially during his initial radio calls. The coded language he used, the assumptions he'd made, it all sounded different in the harsh light of day. "Stop," Miller said suddenly, about halfway through. His voice was strained. "I can't. I know what I did. I know how it sounds. What I don't know is how I didn't see it before." Del Pozo paused the playback and turned to face Miller fully. Through his office window, he could see officers and civilians going about their morning routines in the parking lot below. Each interaction, each brief encounter was a chance to either reinforce or break down the barriers that existed in their community. "Tell me about your training," Del Pozo said, changing direction. "In 15 years, what have you learned about community policing?" Miller straightened slightly, falling back on familiar ground. "We're taught to protect and serve, to maintain order, to..." He trailed off, seeing Del Pozo shaking his head. "That's procedure," the chief corrected gently. "I'm asking about people. Tell me about the communities you serve, the families, the kids, the elderly couples who've lived on the same street for 40 years. Tell me their stories." Miller opened his mouth, then closed it again, The silence in the office grew heavy, broken only by the gentle hum of the heating system and distant office sounds. Finally, he spoke. "I don't know their stories," he admitted. "I know their addresses, their vehicle registrations, their violation histories. But their stories, I never thought to ask." Del Pozo nodded, standing up to walk to a large map of Burlington hanging on his wall. He traced his finger along the streets, stopping at various points. "Every dot on this map is a story," he said. "Every traffic stop, every call for service, every routine patrol, they're all chapters in someone's life story, including yours and mine." He turned back to Miller, who was watching intently. "Last night, you tried to write my story before you ever met me. You saw a car, made assumptions about the driver, and created a narrative that fit what you expected to see. The question is, how many other stories have you written that way?" The question hung in the air between them. Outside, the morning sun had burned away the last of the fog, flooding the office with clear light. Miller's coffee sat untouched, now cold on the desk. "I want to fix this," Miller said finally, his voice firm for the first time that morning. "I need to fix this, not just because I got caught, but because," he struggled for words, "because I'm supposed to be better than this. We're all supposed to be better than this." Del Pozo smiled slightly, the first real smile since the meeting began. "That's exactly why I asked you here instead of filing a complaint, because that moment of realization, that desire to be better, that's where real change begins." He walked back to his desk and pressed a button on his phone. "Send in the morning briefing materials, please," he spoke to his assistant. Turning back to Miller, he continued, "I'm about to head into a briefing about our community policing initiatives. I'd like you to join us." Miller looked surprised. "Sir, consider it the first step," Del Pozo explained. "You said you want to fix this. Well, that starts with understanding the communities we serve, really understanding them. Their hopes, their fears, their daily lives. Not as statistics or potential suspects, but as people." For the first time that morning, Miller took a sip of his coffee, grimacing slightly at the cold liquid. But when he looked up, there was something new in his expression, not quite hope, not quite determination, but something in between. "When does the briefing start?" he asked. Del Pozo checked his watch. 10 minutes. Just enough time to grab fresh coffee and for you to tell me if you're really ready for what comes next. Because this isn't going to be easy, Officer Miller. Changing deeply ingrained patterns never is. The sounds of the station drifted through the closed door. Phones ringing. Officers talking, the everyday symphony of law enforcement. But in that office, something extraordinary was happening. The beginning of a transformation that would ripple out far beyond one traffic stop on a quiet Sunday evening. The morning briefing room buzzed with activity as officers filled their seats, coffee cups and notepads in hand. Miller stood awkwardly near the door, feeling like an outsider in a room full of Burlington officers. The chief had invited him to sit at the front, but he chose a spot near the back, hoping to blend into the background. His mind was still processing the intense conversation from earlier. Del Pozo stood at the podium, waiting for the room to settle. The morning light streamed through the windows, creating long shadows across the worn carpet. Maps and community bulletin boards covered the walls, each filled with photos of local events and newspaper clippings about successful police-community partnerships. "Before we begin our usual briefing," Del Pozo started, his voice carrying clearly through the room, "I want to share something that happened last night." He looked directly at Miller, giving him a slight nod. "It's a story about assumptions, about learning, and about the opportunity for change." The room grew quiet. A few officers shifted in their chairs, sensing this wasn't going to be a typical morning briefing. Someone's radio crackled softly in the background, but was quickly silenced. "Last night, I was pulled over," Del Pozo continued. "Not because I broke any laws, but because of how I looked." He paused, letting that sink in. "And instead of filing a complaint, I invited the officer here today because his response to realizing his mistake showed me something important." Miller felt every eye in the room turn toward him. His first instinct was to stare at the floor, but something made him lift his chin and face his fellow officers. The weight of the moment pressed down on him like a physical force. Del Pozo walked away from the podium, moving to stand in the center of the room. "Officer Miller," he called out, "would you be willing to shed your perspective on what happened?" The silence in the room was deafening. Miller's heart pounded as he slowly stood up. His legs felt like lead as he made his way to the front of the room. Facing his peers was somehow harder than facing the chief in his office. "I've been a police officer for 15 years, he began, his voice shaky at first but growing stronger. "And last night, I learned they're not the officer I thought I was." He took a deep breath, then continued, "I pulled someone over because of how they looked. I made assumptions. I acted on prejudices I didn't even know I had." The room remained silent, but the quality of the silence had changed. It wasn't judgmental anymore, it was attentive, maybe even understanding. Many of the officers were nodding slightly, perhaps recognizing similar moments from their own experiences. "The easy thing would have been to write me up," Miller continued, "to file a complaint and let me face the consequences. But instead, the chief showed me something different. He showed me that we can't change what we don't acknowledge." He turned to face the room fully now, his voice growing more confident. "I watched my dashcam footage last night. I listened to my radio calls, and I heard myself, really heard myself, for the first time. The way I spoke, the assumptions I made, the person I became behind that badge, it wasn't who I want to be." A senior officer in the front row raised his hand. "We've all had moments we're not proud of," he said quietly. "The question is, what do we do about them?" Del Pozo stepped forward again. "That's exactly why we're having this conversation, because this isn't just about one traffic stop or one officer, it's about all of us. It's about the choices we make every day, the assumptions we carry, and our willingness to confront them." He walked to a large whiteboard and picked up a marker. "Let's talk about last night's incident in detail. Not to shame anyone, but to learn. To understand how bias creeps into our work, often without us even noticing." For the next hour, they broke down every moment of the traffic stop. Miller shared his thought process, painful as it was. Other officers contributed their own experiences, their own moments of realization. The conversation was honest, sometimes uncomfortable, but always respectful. Near the end of the session, a young officer spoke up from the middle of the room. "So what happens now? How do we make sure we're not making the same mistakes?" Del Pozo smiled. "That's where the real work begins. Officer Miller has agreed to help develop a new training program, one that uses his experience as a starting point for deeper discussions about bias, community relations, and what it really means to protect and serve everyone equally." Miller nodded, feeling a strange mix of shame and purpose. "I never thought I'd be standing here as an example of what not to do," he said with a slight smile. "But if my mistake can help other officers avoid the same pitfalls, then maybe some good can come from it." The briefing room had grown warm with the morning sun and the body heat of dozens of officers. Someone had opened a window, letting in a fresh breeze that carried the sounds of the city they served, traffic, conversations, the everyday rhythm of community life. "We're starting a new initiative," Del Pozo announced. "Every officer will spend time in community meetings, not as law enforcement, but as listeners. We'll hear stories, understand perspectives, and learn to see beyond our preconceptions." He turned to Miller. "Would you be willing to lead the first session? Share your story, your realizations, your journey?" Miller straightened his shoulders, feeling the weight of responsibility but also the possibility of redemption. "Yes, sir. I think I need to." As the briefing wound down and officers began to file out, many stopped to shake Miller's hand or pat his shoulder. There was no judgment in their gestures, only support and understanding. They all knew it could have been any one of them in his position. Del Pozo watched from the podium, seeing the seeds of change beginning to take root. Sometimes the hardest lessons led to the most profound transformations. And in that crowded briefing room, on a bright morning in Burlington, something remarkable was starting to grow. 1 year had passed since that fateful traffic stop on a quiet Sunday evening. The autumn leaves were falling again in Burlington, but much had changed in those 12 months. The community center was packed for tonight's monthly police community forum, with every seat filled and people standing along the walls. Officer Miller stood at the podium, looking out at the diverse crowd. His uniform was as crisp as ever, but he carried himself differently now, more open, more approachable. The nervousness he felt during his first community presentation had been replaced by a quiet confidence born of experience and genuine connection. "A year ago," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the room, "I made a traffic stop that changed my life. I thought I was just doing my job, but I was actually doing it wrong. Tonight, I want to share how that moment transformed not just me, but our entire approach to community policing. The audience listened intently. Among them sat Chief Del Pozo, who had made it a point to attend every one of these monthly forums. He watched with quiet satisfaction as Miller engaged with the community he'd once viewed with suspicion. "We've made real changes," Miller continued, clicking through slides that showed statistics from the past year. "Traffic stops are down by 40%, but our community safety ratings have actually improved. Why? Because we're focusing on building relationships instead of just enforcing laws." He gestured to a group of officers seated in the front row, graduates of the new training program he'd helped develop. "Every officer now spends time in the community as a listener first, a law enforcer second. We attend neighborhood cookouts, school events, local business meetings. We get to know the people we serve as people, not just as potential suspects." An elderly woman raised her hand from the middle of the room. "I've lived here for 40 years, she said, her voice slightly shaky but clear. "And this is the first time I felt comfortable walking into a police station to report a problem. Last week, when I saw some suspicious activity in my neighborhood, I didn't hesitate to call." The officer who responded, he knew my name, asked about my grandchildren. "That matters." Miller nodded, remembering how he used to handle such calls. All business, no connection. That's exactly what we're aiming for. When we know our community, when we're part of it rather than just policing it, everyone benefits. He clicked to the next slide, showing a graph of complaint statistics. Reports of officer bias are down by 60%. But more importantly, look at this number. He pointed to another statistic. Community engagement is up by 200%. People are coming to us before problems escalate. They trust us to help, not just to enforce. From the back of the room, a teenager stood up. "I used to be scared when I saw police cars in my neighborhood," he said. "Now I know most of the officers by name. Last month, Officer Miller even came to my basketball game." The room filled with murmurs of agreement. Similar stories began to surface. Officers helping with homework at the community center, joining neighborhood cleanup efforts, showing up to support local events. Small actions that had built into something much bigger. Chief Del Pozo took the podium next, standing beside Miller. "What you're seeing here isn't just a program or a policy change," he explained. "It's a fundamental shift in how we view our role in this community. And it all started with one officer being brave enough to confront his own biases and commit to change." Miller felt his face flush slightly at the praise, but he stood straighter. The past year hadn't been easy. There had been difficult conversations, uncomfortable realizations, and moments of doubt. But standing here now, seeing the real impact of those changes, made it all worthwhile. "We've trained over 200 officers from departments across the state," he added. "They come here to learn not just from our successes, but from our mistakes. Every officer who goes through our program hears about that traffic stop. They watch the dashcam footage. They see how easy it is to let bias influence our actions, and more importantly, they learn how to recognize and correct it." A local business owner stood up next. "I've noticed a difference in how officers interact with everyone, not just certain groups. There's more respect, more understanding. It feels like they're part of our community now, not just watching over it." As the evening continued, more stories were shared. A young mother talked about how her children no longer feared police officers. A shop owner described how regular visits from patrol officers had helped prevent problems before they started. A high school teacher shared how student attitudes toward law enforcement had shifted. Near the end of the forum, Miller shared one final statistic. "Last month, we had our lowest number of traffic stops in department history, but our highest community satisfaction rating." That's not a coincidence. When we focus on building trust instead of just enforcing laws, everyone wins. The chief stepped forward again. "What started as one difficult moment has grown into something remarkable. But we're not done. This is just the beginning of a longer journey." As people began to file out of the community center, many stopped to chat with officers, sharing stories and concerns with the easy familiarity of neighbors rather than the tension of authority figures. The autumn air was crisp and cool, carrying the sounds of laughter and conversation into the evening. Miller and Del Pozo stood at the entrance, watching the natural interactions between officers and community members. "Did you ever imagine this?" Miller asked quietly. "That night, when you pulled me into your office, did you see this coming?" Del Pozo smiled. "I saw potential," he replied. "In you, in our department, in our community. But this?" He gestured to the scene before them. Officers and citizens talking freely, children high-fiving uniformed patrol officers, elderly residents sharing concerns without fear. This exceeded even my hopes. As the last few people drifted away into the evening, Miller reflected on how far they'd come. One traffic stop, one moment of confronting his own biases, had sparked a transformation that continued to ripple outward. It wasn't perfect. There was still work to be done, still trust to be built, still lessons to be learned. But they were moving in the right direction, one relationship at a time. The streetlights flickered on, casting a warm glow over the community center parking lot. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for growth. But tonight, in this moment, they could see the real impact of what they'd built together. A model of what policing could be when it was grounded in understanding, respect, and genuine human connection.